Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of History Quest. I'm your host, and today we are at the Paynesville Historical Society in Paynesville, Minnesota. Now I've just got to say that this is my hometown, and I was actually the director here for 4 years, so today I'll be giving the tour. So follow me and let's take a look. All right, so this is one of my favorite displays here at the Historical Society. This is a 4,000-year-old buffalo skeleton. It was found south of Paynesville in kind of a marshy area, and it's actually the bones of several bison put together. It's not just one bison. It's a woods bison, so it's like different from what you would see like in Dances with Wolves. These were actually a little bit bigger. And the horns here, the span would have been about like this, because these are just the cores of the horns. They're not the actual horns anymore. But at any rate, the story is that these bison would go drink in this marshy area. They would get stuck, and it would basically be like quicksand, suck them in, and they would drown in there. And that's why there were several skeletons in there that they made this out of. The farmer who found this was digging a drainage ditch and happened to come on some bones. The more he dug, the more he found, and eventually he had tubs filled with bones. And over a winter, him and his wife put this together in their basement. So it's kind of neat. One of my favorite things here. So this is the timeline, and this is kind of the main or oldest exhibit at the museum would be this front room with the timeline. It starts at prehistory and it runs all the way till almost present time. On the top, we have national history, and on the bottom, we have more local history. So the story of Paynesville starts in the 1850s, mid-1850s. About 1856, a gentleman from the St. Cloud area came this way. His name was William B. Reed. He's actually from Hastings, but at any rate, he led a party of settlers to this area, and one of those settlers' names was Edwin Payne. And so Edwin Payne struck a claim, him and his brother-in-law, and they were the first permanent settlers in the area. Of course, being his name was Payne, the town was called Paynesville at that time. So the plat for the town was filed in 1857. It became official the following year in 1858. About this time, you really only had about a dozen families living in the area as basically wilderness. A big event in Paynesville, just as in Hutchinson or anywhere in McLeod County, of course, is in 1862 during the Sioux Uprising or Dakota War, depending upon how politically correct you want to be today. In Paynesville, word came in that there were attacks down south and out west, and so the settlers banded together and they created a little sod fort, which would be on the west end of town today. Everybody had moved into this sod fort, anybody who could. A lot of them would go out and work in their farms during the day, and then they would sleep in the fort at night. In August of 1862, after the fort was built, the U.S. Army came through and they evacuated the town, so everybody was essentially a refugee. They either went to Richmond or St. Cloud. Some of them went even farther east. With that said, in September, there were 9 gentlemen who were in Richmond, who were from Paynesville, who wanted to go back to Paynesville and harvest the wheat that they had been growing because it was time to thresh. So they brought a threshing rig with them. They came to Paynesville. They worked for about 3 days, and on the third night, they were staying in the fort, and they woke up and the fort was on fire, and there was a huge band of warring Dakota attacking the town and looking for the men. There was a brief little skirmish. One man was wounded in the leg. They were able to pull him to safety and cross the river. and it was nighttime, and so the war party started searching for him, and in the meanwhile they're also destroying the town, they're burning the buildings, they're just completely destroying everything. At any rate, these 9 gentlemen had luck on their side because a terrible rainstorm just happened to erupt right at that time, and so these gentlemen were able to escape under the rain. When people finally started coming back to Paynesville about a month later, the entire town was destroyed except for 2 buildings, and they were both owned by a man named Daniel Chisholm, who was actually a very good friend of Little Crow. So after the war with the Dakota, there was kind of with the Civil War still going on, there weren't a whole lot of settlers coming into Minnesota anymore. Once the Civil War was over, that flow of immigrants started to pick up again. And here, very, very important, at least to me, in 1868, the Haynes family came into Paynesville. James Haynes, he was the oldest sibling of the family. He and his family struck out their claim just east of town, which is today the current downtown Paynesville. And they came, they bred horses. They actually drove an entire herd of horses here from Illinois, and before that they had come from Canada. And so from Canada down to Illinois and then back up to Paynesville. And the whole reason they came to Paynesville is because there was a shortage of horses here. And so they had their little ranch in what is now downtown Paynesville. And just kind of a cool story. So that's how I got here. Another important date is, or another important year is 1886. So in 1886, 2 railroads came to Paynesville. You had the Great Northern Railroad and you had the Soo Line Railroad. The Soo Line Railroad still comes through town today. At any rate, these 2 railroads were rivals, and they refused to build a depot anywhere near each other. And so a faction of the town wanted to move north of Paynesville, where they were going to build a depot and start a new town there. Well, the other line, the Soo Line, was kind of going to run east. And so my ancestor, James Haynes, actually met with the executives of the Soo Line, which was a man named William Washburn. And essentially, we also have a street named Washburn and a street named James Street, so after those 2. But at any rate, they started plotting a town together on what was the Haynes farm, and they built a depot. They gave a few lots away to town or to businesses in Old Paynesville, and they sold off the rest of the lots. And for a short time, the town was called Jimtown after James Haynes. Well, at any rate, so there's a period where you have 3 Paynesvilles, and these 3 Paynesvilles absolutely hated each other. They all had their own post offices. If a letter was delivered to North Paynesville, meant for Old Paynesville or meant for Jimtown, it was sent back to the cities rather than just walking across the river and delivering it. But there was, your editorials in the paper at the time were just filled with accusations and gossip about the other towns. It came to blows at certain times. It was really bad. There was actually a point where the post office stepped in and said, okay, you guys get 1 post office, figure out where it's going to be because we're done with this. And so they put a post office kind of in the middle of Old Paynesville and Jimtown, or what was being touted as New Paynesville at this time. And all the mail was delivered there. Meanwhile, the little rivalry wasn't over. Kind of an interesting story on this. Late at night, during this big rivalry, people from from Jimtown snuck into North Paynesville, where the fire department was, because the people from Jimtown wanted the fire department to be there, and they snuck into the garage and actually stole all the equipment, touted it back to New Paynesville, and the fire department then moved there. So at any rate, while the railroads are being built, for a time it looked like the Great Northern was going to reach North Paynesville before the Soo Line reached New Paynesville. Now these two railroads were going to converge at one point, and whoever reached there first would have the right-of-way over the other railroad. So they were racing to this area. Well, the people from New Paynesville wanted to make sure that the Soo Line was going to get in first, so they actually one night went out and met the, hey, we just saw you. One night went out and met the Great Northern crew and stopped the Great Northern crew, wouldn't let them come through anymore. And meanwhile, you have other men from New Paynesville who went out and were helping to build the grade for the Soo Line so the Soo Line could reach the right-of-way point faster. Because of this, the Soo Line did end up winning out. And as history goes, New Paynesville had a little bit more industry. It was new, hence the name. And so the buildings were brick buildings instead of wood buildings. It was a little bit bigger, and over the years it just kind of swallowed the other two up. The Great Northern eventually stopped running, and in North Paynesville it's basically a ghost town today. There's just one business left out there. New Paynesville has since grown to include Old Paynesville. And interesting, when they diverted the highway outside of town, because it used to run right through town, through where downtown is now, when they diverted the highway out, and it moved to the west into what was Old Paynesville, and now you're seeing a shift of new business and everything moving out there. So it's just kind of come full circle, but very interesting story, one of my favorites. So this is our log cabin. It's a little bit smaller than the Shiru log cabin in McLeod County. However, this is authentic. It is made from logs that were cut to be a log cabin. So when right before I had made the move to Hutchinson to work at the county museum, we actually had made plans to go get this. And so believe it or not, because if any of you that know me well will like to accuse me of not working that hard, I actually did help dismantle this cabin, bring it to the museum and store it. And then of course I came to all you folks and didn't get to help put this back together, but I did work on it. So, just keep that in mind. All right, so we follow our timeline down, and here we're at 1904. And this is another important date in the town's history because it was when Old Paynesville and New Paynesville consolidated and just became one Paynesville. Hard feelings still kind of lingered a little bit because there were still people living up in North Paynesville and there were still people living over in what was Old Paynesville. They still each had their own baseball teams. They still each had their own newspapers. And one little interesting editorial that I read was from about this time, and each paper had like a gossip column or a news column talking about what's happening in the other two towns. And in the Paynesville Leader, which is now the Paynesville Press, from New Paynesville at any rate, the Paynesville Leader had in there that we have nothing to report on Northtown this week, and that is because nothing exciting ever happens there and it's not worth our time. Paynesville, of course, is in close proximity to two lakes. We have Lake Coronis and we have Rice Lake, and because of that there was a great resort industry in Paynesville starting about late 1800s, early 1900s when the railroad came through, and people are moving about looking for places to vacation. And several resorts ended up being built on the shores of Lake Coronis. Fishing, boating, beach time. I imagine it was a great time to be alive, and also I caught that fish. There's a very important place of business in Paynesville. It's called Coronis Parts. And the reason it's very important is for what you see right here. So the jet skis had been around for quite a while, starting back in the 1950s already. However, they were all your typical stand-up jet skis, and they took a little bit of finesse to drive them around. Well, there's a company in Paynesville that made snowmobile parts, Coronas parts. And Ed and Kathy Webb, they were the owners, had this idea to make a sit-down jet ski with a snowmobile engine. And that is what you have right here. So this is actually the first sit-down jet ski, and it was made right here in Paynesville, patented right here in Paynesville. What happened was when they would give tours of the facility, other companies would come in and would, at any way try to, steal the technology and started making their own, because pretty soon you had other companies making the exact same thing. But it's just interesting to note that the sit-down jet ski, or wet jet as they were called, started right here in Paynesville. This is the village exhibit at the Paynesville Museum. It is a replica of a Victorian-style village. A lot of the businesses are actually modeled after businesses that used to exist in Paynesville. Some of them still do. My favorite has always been the hotel or saloon right here, and I really think you should come in and check it out. So we used to do a gala when I was the director here. And the very first gala we ever did was like an Old West sort of thing. And so everybody came dressed. It was awesome. We had like 150 people in the museum dressed like we were in the Old West. And it may not be the smartest thing to do, but it was definitely the funnest thing to do. We had a bartender set up behind the bar, serving beer to people when they came in. It was great. But this has always been one of my favorite places in the museum. So like any town in Minnesota, ice making was very important. In the early 1900s, Paynesville was home to a creamery that came and built up along the Sioux line that came through. One of the main ice companies was Hartman Ice Company. They would head over to Lake Coronas, they would cut out their chunks of ice. The creamery was one of the biggest buyers of the ice. But anybody in town, because they had ice boxes, they didn't have electricity, so everybody needed ice. Hartman Ice was in operation until about the 1970s, and they had stopped making ice, but the ice was still in their house, or in their little ice chest thing, ice shed, a few years later. And what's interesting is there was a party, and my uncle knew Hartman Ice people, and they needed ice, so he went and got into their shed and found one tiny little block of half melted ice. So my family got the last bit of ice made by Hartman Ice Company. So here is the livery stable in the village exhibit, and if you look at the very top, there's an old musket up there, and that's actually a Confederate Civil War musket. And I don't know why I think that's so cool, but I just think that's so cool. The one underneath is a Sharps, which was a Union cavalry weapon. And there's a little .22 underneath that really isn't as cool as the other two. But that top one, I think maybe the reason I find it so interesting is because I did the research and dug up that it was a Confederate musket, and the history nerd in me was like just salivating. I still think it's cool. Here we are in the Ebenezer Church. It is a German evangelical church that was built in the 1890s just southeast of Paynesville along the edge of the big woods. In 2011, the Historical Society ended up getting the church and had it brought over there. So they literally brought the church up, put trailers under it, and moved it here and set it down. We tried, because I was here at that time, we tried to keep it as, authentic as we could to what it would have looked like when it was built. Here is actually the last register from the last service up there. The Bibles are actually written in German, and we do have, it's not up here right now, but we do have the original Bible from the church that was brought over. And this is actually the piano that was in the church. We were able to find that and have that brought over as well. Same with the two chairs up top. Those were original to the church, as was this, as was this. This is the Brown Schoolhouse, and it was also just outside of Paynesville to the south. And in the 1980s, it was brought over to the museum, and it's been in the Paynesville Historical Society has possessed it ever since. And what's really cool about this is not every schoolhouse had indoor outhouses, and that's just awesome. Here we are inside the Brown Schoolhouse at the museum. If you look up on the wall, you'll see some of the old music is written in German. If you start looking at the books, you'll find some of the old books are written in German. Much like the church we were just in, the schoolhouse, or the students spoke German when they came in. Up until World War I, a lot of people in Stearns County were speaking German. As a matter of fact, my grandma still speaks it fluently. She didn't learn English until she had gone to school. Just like in McLeod County, where German and German heritage is very prevalent. Well, that concludes our tour of the Paynesville Historical Society in Paynesville, Minnesota. If you're ever up this way, if you're going to Lake Coronis to stay at Bugby Hive Resort, or if you're traveling to St. Cloud, if you're ever through Paynesville, I highly recommend coming in and checking things out. Thank you so much for watching again this month, and next month we haven't quite decided where we're going to go yet, but we'll be back and we'll be at another location. So thanks everybody.